prison epistles written around 62 AD from prison in Rome as he's waiting to go to his trial before Caesar. At the end of Acts, you recall, he made an appeal to Caesar, and he's now been taken to Rome, and he's there in Rome and under house arrest, which means he has people coming and going, he has people seeing him, he has people providing for him, he has gifts being met, but he's not able to leave the house. He's not able to leave Rome. He's confined to that place. In Colossians, in the book of Colossians, Paul proclaims Christ as Lord over all creation, and he talks about his redemption of all people. So this Christ, who's Lord of all, has totally secured redemption for all people. That's a really good theme for the book of Colossians. While ministering at Ephesus, you see, Paul didn't start the church at Colossae. While he was ministering at Ephesus, he was there for 3 years, if you recall. In that 3-year ministry, folks went from Ephesus because it was a natural trade, it was a natural postal route to move from Ephesus through Colossae. Colossae was a rather large city. And they would move from place, and so as the gospel hit Ephesus, it was taken by others to Colossae, and a church began there. But because it hadn't had Paul's deep teaching necessarily, there were some dangerous teachings, dangerous ideas that were coming up, were presenting themselves. One specifically was this by the Judaizers, saying that you had to combine grace and law together in order to be righteous before God. What Paul is going to do in this book, one of the things Paul is going to do is he's going to warn against that teaching and going to encourage that salvation is a faith alone deal. There's no work of law that can add to grace. There's no day you can keep. There's no festival you can do. There's no food you can eat that's going to make you righteous before God. It's Christ's righteousness and Christ's righteousness alone that makes you right before God. It's his work on the cross that accomplished that. He does this because if we take anything else, then we're not really encouraging, we're not really reaching real Christian maturity. And that's what Paul calls this church to at Colossae. He calls them to real Christian maturity. He calls them not to be puffed up, not to be full of air like a balloon, but to be full of knowledge, full and grown up to a full knowledge of God. So he really is encouraging them not to puff themselves up through vain philosophies, through pursuits that ought not to be pursued, through doctrines of angels, those kinds of things. That all was beginning to happen at Colossae, and so Paul takes this opportunity while he's in prison to write this letter to them. Paul's going to send this letter at the same time that he sends the letter of Ephesians and the letter of Philemon. All three are written at the same time. All three were carried by the same messenger, and all three were taken to the area at the same time. Ephesians and Colossians have many similar themes. If you've already read Ephesians, you will recognize a lot of those themes as you come to Colossians. In fact, sometimes it almost seems like the same exact wording, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Other places like that, you're going to see that the ideas are very closely related. The idea of husband and wife and marriage, the idea of masters and slaves, the ideas of children and parents, they're all there. And so you know that Paul had some of the same things on his mind as he's writing to Ephesus and as he's writing to Colossae. You'll also find that there's a great deal of similarity between the book of Colossians and the book of Philemon, because they are also written at the same time. And what we know is Philemon was a guy who lived in Colossae and went to the Colossian church. So you'll see a lot of similarities as you read these books, but there's enough difference in the books that there's still a very exciting and very important read, because Paul's addressing different things and trying to accomplish a different purpose as he writes the book. This book is like I said, this book is really proclaiming Christ as the Lord over all creation. And as Paul does that, he basically gives, I made it, I think it's a 8-point outline with greetings and thankfulness being first. What Paul does at the very first part of the letter is just greet them, and he expresses such gratitude for them, for their work in the gospel, for their work of faith, how the work of faith is heard throughout the world. And then he actually spends 5 verses praying for the Colossians. As he did in Ephesians, he does a lot of this same type of thing, and he lays out his prayer for them. He lays out the prayer that they would continue to grow in that they wouldn't hold fast to what they had, but they would actually grow further in their growth, in their faith. So he prays for the Colossians, and then he has praise for Christ in chapter 1, verses 15 through 2-3. He praises Christ for who he is, as the preeminent one of creation, as the firstborn of all creation, as the one who not only created, but the one who sustains, the one that holds all things together by the word of his power. He paints a powerful picture of Christ in verses 16 and 17, one that ought not to be missed. Then Paul talks about the gospel. Paul then lays out the gospel for them in chapter 1, verse 24 through 2-3. He talks about the importance of the gospel. He talks about why the gospel matters. And he talks there about the importance of the gospel being enough for salvation. We don't need to add things to it. And then he begins to address the false teaching, the dangerous teaching that's going on there. And he does that in the remainder of chapter 2. He talks about the dangerous teaching, about the combining of law and grace, the worshiping of angels, or the study of angels, of the keeping of a day over another day, and judging others who don't keep that day, eating food or not eating food. He encourages the Colossians that even food doesn't defile a person. As he then moves to past the dangerous teaching, he then gives some proper teaching, how they ought to work, how they ought to live, how they ought to believe, and that's in chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And then in chapter 3, verses 5 through 4-6, there's this large section on Christian living, and that's the section that really looks a lot like Ephesians 5 and 6. It looks a lot like that, because really the fact is Christian living doesn't change. The way we live as a husband doesn't change because of where we are in a city. The way we live as a father doesn't change because we live in America and not in some other city, not some other place. The responsibilities of fathers don't change. The responsibility of husbands don't change. The responsibility of wives don't change. It's all the same. Those responsibilities remain, and he calls them to live in Christ, and to live out their faith, to live in a way that pleases God, and to show their faith by the way they live. And then finally, the last part of chapter 4 is his personal instructions, his personal greetings, and his closing salutation. So, Book of Colossians is another really important book as far as how we live and work in our society even today.